The courtroom was supposed to be a place of order, restraint, and professionalism. But from the moment Karoline Leavitt stepped into the hearing, it was clear this day would defy all expectations. Dressed with poise and her signature intensity, she wasn't there as a defendant or a prosecutor, but as a representative in a high-profile legal advisory hearing. The subject? A landmark policy battle that had gripped Washington. What should have been a procedural discussion spiraled rapidly when Chief Judge James Boasberg opened the session with a tone that felt less like judicial neutrality and more like a personal grudge. Karoline had faced hostile environments before, but something about Boasberg's demeanor was different. His gavel might have brought silence to the room, but his expression radiated disdain. It wasn't long before his language shifted from formal to biting, and his words, meant to challenge legal arguments, began veering into character attacks. He didn't just dismiss her perspective, he diminished her. And it was not subtle. Every comment dripped with contempt, referencing not just her political stance, but her career trajectory, her youth, and even her appearance. The room grew colder with each exchange. At first the gallery stayed silent, unsure whether what they were witnessing was truly unfolding. But Karoline, never one to shrink from confrontation, didn't let the disrespect slide. She sharpened her own words with surgical precision, pressing back against the judge's condescension, not as a guest in his courtroom, but as an equal in the national arena. The atmosphere shifted. This was no longer a legal hearing. It was a standoff. As tensions escalated, Boasberg leaned further into his fury, and what began as subtle jabs soon turned into open hostility. He accused her of manipulation, of exploiting the court for political gain, even of endangering the integrity of the judiciary. It was beyond inappropriate. It was explosive. Karoline's face remained composed, but her silence said more than any words could. She knew this had gone too far, and so did everyone else in the courtroom. Reporters began taking frantic notes. Aides exchanged wide-eyed glances. The clerk looked visibly uncomfortable, but the most telling reaction came from one of Boasberg's fellow judges who sat quietly at the side, his jaw set tight, eyes locked on the bench with quiet disbelief. This wasn't about justice anymore. This was a public breakdown. Karoline finally responded, not by raising her voice, but by dissecting every accusation with controlled force. She broke down the timeline of her involvement, the purpose of her testimony, and the pattern of Boasberg's behavior throughout the session. The courtroom, which had swelled with hostility just moments before, now simmered with focused energy. Boasberg's tone began to crack. He reached for legalese, for the structure of the law, but it was too late. His image of control had fractured. By the time Karoline finished, the gallery was holding its breath. The judge sat motionless for a moment before slamming the gavel once more, not to regain order, but to end the hearing altogether. As he exited through the back door, his robe billowing behind him, no one in the room knew exactly what would come next. But everyone knew something had shifted. This wasn't just another courtroom drama. It had become a national moment. The fallout began almost immediately. Within hours of the courtroom confrontation, clips began circulating online. Though cameras weren't officially permitted, a leaked audio recording paired with courtroom sketches painted a vivid enough picture. Social media erupted. Hashtags bearing Boasberg's name shot to the top of trending charts. People weren't just angry, they were stunned. Commentators across the spectrum, even those usually critical of Karoline, voiced discomfort with what had happened. What was supposed to be a civil legal debate had turned into something deeply personal, and now the country wanted answers. Inside the judicial corridors, murmurs spread like wildfire. Judges who once respected Boasberg's iron grip on order were now questioning his judgment. Clerks spoke in hushed tones about prior incidents, moments over the years when Boasberg's temper had flared in less visible ways. But this was different. This wasn't behind closed doors. This was public, undeniable, and laced with what many saw as a clear bias against Karoline, a sitting political figure with national visibility. Karoline herself remained silent in the immediate aftermath. Her team issued no official statement. She attended a scheduled event later that evening, with the same composure she had displayed in the courtroom, refusing to let the moment overshadow her broader message. That silence, strategic and firm, only intensified public interest. It left the narrative wide open, and Boasberg had no control over it. The Judicial Oversight Committee met the next morning in an emergency session. Whispers turned into formal. Grievances and members of the bench began questioning whether Boasberg's outburst was a one-time lapse or a pattern of behavior finally pushed into the light. Though internal investigations take weeks, if not months, pressure was mounting to act swiftly. Members of the committee knew that inaction would be seen as complicity. Meanwhile, Boasberg returned to his chambers, refusing media requests and releasing only a sterile statement about upholding judicial integrity. But behind the scenes, he was anything but composed. Sources from within the courthouse described shouting matches behind closed doors, tense meetings with legal advisors, and a growing sense that he was losing his grip on the authority he once commanded with ease. Even his longtime clerks were beginning to avoid eye contact, their loyalty tested by the gravity of what had unfolded. Then came the turning point. A respected former judge, who had once mentored Boasberg early in his career, broke his silence. In an op-ed that landed like a thunderclap, he described the courtroom exchange as an abuse of power, one that not only disrespected a witness, but undermined the integrity of the judicial process itself. His words weren't inflammatory, they were measured, precise, and devastating. Karoline, still refusing to gloat, issued a brief statement acknowledging the overwhelming public support and reaffirming her belief in the legal system's ability to self-correct. She didn't name Boasberg. She didn't have to. By the end of the week, internal court documents leaked, revealing that several complaints had been filed against Boasberg in the past, none as explosive as this, but each marked by the same tone: combative, dismissive, and increasingly erratic. What had happened with Karoline wasn't a deviation. It was the culmination of a slow and steady unraveling. But no one was prepared for what would come next, a final hearing that would determine Boasberg's fate. The same courtroom where he had attempted to humiliate Karoline would now be the scene of his reckoning. The courtroom felt different this time. There was no fiery tension, no raucous outbursts waiting to erupt. Instead, a heavy stillness hung in the air, the kind that comes before a storm breaks. Not with noise, but with consequence. Judge Boasberg entered not from the usual rear door behind the bench, but from a side entrance, unaccompanied and visibly altered. The same confidence that had once filled every inch of his presence was now replaced by something quieter, unsettled. The eyes that once darted sharply across the room now avoided contact altogether. The hearing wasn't open to the public, but media crews clustered outside, covering every new development with unrelenting interest. Inside, a special judicial panel had been assembled to examine the full extent of Boasberg's conduct, not just in the recent incident, but across the last few years. Each member of the panel brought with them a career of experience, yet even they seemed unnerved by the gravity of the situation. It wasn't every day a federal judge stood on the brink of removal. What tipped the balance wasn't just public outrage, nor was it Karoline's rising political presence. It was the sheer scale of the documentation that had been brought forward. Witnesses from within the judiciary, clerks, former assistants, even fellow judges, came forward with statements detailing years of professional misconduct. Some described verbal tirades, others recalled overtly biased rulings. But all roads led to one undeniable truth. Boasberg had let his personal feelings erode his role as a neutral arbiter of the law. Karoline did not attend the hearing, but her presence was felt in every word. One segment of the inquiry focused entirely on the courtroom confrontation that had sparked the national conversation. The language Boasberg used, the aggressive tone, the pointed remarks, all were dissected and replayed through sworn testimonies and recordings. Legal experts chimed in remotely, stating flatly that Boasberg's actions had crossed an ethical line from which there was no return. Even his defenders had little to stand on. Some tried to paint the incident as a momentary lapse, a miscalculation fueled by stress or fatigue. But those arguments collapsed under the weight of patterns. Boasberg, it became clear, had allowed his authority to become a weapon, and this time he had aimed it at someone who refused to back down. By mid-afternoon, Boasberg was invited to respond. He rose slowly, adjusted the front of his robe, and addressed the panel with a tone far removed from the fierce judge who once thundered across his courtroom. He defended his service record, recited the years he had committed to public duty, and hinted that he had been provoked. But the words rang hollow. His performance lacked the precision and fire he was once known for. What remained was a man trying to escape a shadow he himself had cast. The panel recessed for deliberation, and for several long hours the building remained under a strange, suspended silence. Reporters milled about, speculating on whether the committee would recommend censure, suspension, or the unthinkable, removal. The anticipation grew heavier by the minute. Finally, as dusk crept over the city, the panel returned. Boasberg stood, once more, but his shoulders sagged now, as if he already knew. The presiding member of the panel, an elder stateswoman with decades of judicial service behind her, delivered the decision without theatrics. Judge James Boasberg was to be removed from his post, effective immediately, based on violations of judicial ethics and abuse of authority. Outside the building, the announcement hit like a thunderclap. A judge of his stature, once considered untouchable, had just been taken down, not by scandal, not by corruption, but by the sheer force of accountability. As the announcement rippled across Washington, the reaction was swift and polarizing. Some in Boasberg's former circles expressed disbelief, clinging to the memory of a once celebrated jurist known for his intellect and sharp mind. But others, including those who had quietly endured his outbursts over the years, felt a rare and sobering sense of relief. For them, this wasn't just the fall of a man. It was the restoration of a principle long overshadowed by ego, that even those at the top are not above the standards they swear to uphold. Karoline Leavitt, who had remained largely silent through the entire disciplinary process, finally stepped in front of the cameras. Her tone was measured, her message sharp. She didn't claim victory or seek vengeance, but instead directed attention back to the institution itself, a reminder that courts must remain a place of fairness and discipline, not dominance and ridicule. Her dignity throughout the ordeal, even in the face of personal attacks, only elevated her standing in the public eye. Political analysts who had once dismissed her as merely provocative now reevaluated their stance. She had weathered the storm not just as a political figure, but as someone who had stood against raw judicial aggression and held her ground. That strength, visible from the moment Boasberg raised his voice to the second she left the courtroom, in silence, resonated far beyond her party lines. She became a symbol, not just for young political voices, but for anyone ever dismissed or disrespected by unchecked authority. In the weeks that followed, calls grew for a broader inquiry into judicial conduct nationwide. What happened with Boasberg triggered a wider movement, one that forced transparency onto an institution long shielded from public scrutiny. Seminars were launched on professional conduct. Oversight processes were re-evaluated. What began as an explosive moment in one courtroom became a reckoning for an entire system. For Boasberg, there was no return to form. The legal community that once embraced him moved on quickly, unwilling to risk its credibility by defending the indefensible. He retreated from the public eye, his reputation shredded not by scandal, but by arrogance on full display. A man who, Once silenced courtrooms with a glance now found himself ignored entirely. Karoline, on the other hand, only rose higher. Her commitment to integrity, even when provoked beyond reason, earned her not only national respect, but a rare kind of credibility. In interviews that followed, she never focused on Boasberg as an individual, but on the lesson embedded in the moment. No matter the rank or title, professionalism matters, and when violated, it must be confronted. Her story was no longer just about surviving an attack. It became a turning point, a moment when a woman underestimated by many stood firm in the storm and refused to break. And as she continued her path forward, the courtroom incident faded into the backdrop, not as a scandal, but as proof that courage, when wielded calmly and deliberately, could bring even the most untouchable to account. The court system recovered, lessons were learned, and justice, for once, felt complete. There was no applause, no celebration, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing the system had corrected itself. And for those who had watched every second of the confrontation, every escalation, and every resolution, one thing was clear. This was not just another political squabble. It was a reckoning, and it ended exactly as it should.